Here we are at episode 2. Hopefully we can keep this to a weekly thing. Just like last week, we've got myself, Chucky, from the forums, and we've also got Jigsaw.
Hey guys.
So we've got a action-packed show today. Well, not really.
I like the optimism.
Yeah. The movies that we've got lined up today: Prom Night, the original movie from 1980. We've got Carrie, the original movie from 1976. Jeez, it seems like all of these are getting remade. We've also got Beyond the Gates, a more recent movie. We're actually taking a turn and doing an action movie. We're going to discuss Bloodsport from 1988. And we've also got Eyes of a Stranger from the early 80s.
Now, I'm guessing many of you know Prom Night, the 1980 slasher classic. Pretty expected plot. As kids, a bunch of kids, it's sort of like a I Know You Did Last Summer type thing. They accidentally cast the death of another kid. Then we flash forward, I think it's like, 6, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, something like that. And then they're in high school, and then over the course of the movie, people are mysteriously dying as revenge for the death or potential death of this one kid many years ago. And throughout the course of the movie, we have some main characters who are trying to sort of figure out what's going on. Well, actually, I'm not sure if anybody knows. Anybody's really dying until toward the end of the movie. A lot of it's just sort of high school drama, getting ready for the prom type thing, which you can probably expect from a movie called Prom Night. It's a decent slasher for the time. There's some decent kills, there's a decent decapitation. My personal opinion, the movie isn't quite as mesmerizing as other slashers around the same time. You know, even though Jamie Lee Curtis is decent in this movie. She was, of course, better in Halloween. Same year Prom Night came out, there was a movie named Terror Chain, which I personally thought was a much better, more suspenseful slasher. And there's other slashers around the same time, such as My Bloody Valentine, that have a lot more, in my opinion, kick than Prom Night. Overall, I would say Prom Night's decent, but when it comes to early 80s slashers, Prom Night's not usually the movie I find myself watching. I have seen it about 4 or 5 times, and I appreciate it, but it's not one of my personal favorites.
Yeah. Prom Night's a movie that I never really watched when I was young. I definitely heard about it. I guess I never managed to see it at the video store at the right time. So I've only ever seen it a few times, and I think the first time I saw it was probably in my early 20s. And it's a movie that I actually rather enjoy. As I do, I enjoy a lot of slasher movies. Because of the time period it's set in, a lot of the music and fashion is reminiscent of time that I can remember, at least from when I was much younger. And I think for me, another reason why I don't know if this is a reason why I enjoy it, but it's just a convenient thing to say, but my high school prom really sucked. So, anytime I can see someone else have a bad time at a prom or something go crazy at a prom, I gotta really get a kick out of it. I don't think the actual slasher scenes themselves, outside of that one decapitation that you mentioned, there's not a whole lot to it. I mean, there's a bit of running around there towards the end. The majority of the movie, though, there's not really any chase scenes or anything.
Yeah, it's a pretty slow beginning, in my opinion.
I mean, they're really building up to what's going to happen on Prom Night, but you're not really seeing all these people like a traditional slasher movie, where every 10-20 minutes someone's getting chased and killed. For this one, most of that happens towards the end of the movie. So maybe, I don't know for you, maybe for you that's a part of the reason why it doesn't work as well as some of the others.
I also feel like once we find out the identity of the killer near the end of the movie, it didn't entirely jive with me. I just felt like the killer, who was the character we of course had been introduced to before, I feel like people would have noticed this character gone during the time the murders took place. And it's easy to say, he just disappeared and he ends up being the killer, but it didn't feel right to me. Now, on a related note, I actually thought the ending was probably one of my favorite parts of the movie. It's a very emotional scene, which is quite unlike many slashes. It's helped along by in my opinion, a pretty decently depressing song titled Fade to Black. And the movie ends on a rather depressive note, emotional note, that a lot of times sort of seem out of place in a slasher movie. So I will give it credit for that. It's a sort of unique feel. No, and of course there are a few characters in the movie who are enjoyable. I mean, who doesn't like seeing Jamie Lee Curtis? And I'm not sure which actor played him, but the guy who played Slick. I mean, Slick was a pretty fun character anytime he was on screen. Though I cannot believe for a second that guy was in high school. Um, I know. My biggest issue with the movie is it takes a decent time to get going, and once it really gets going, it's not like some explosive finale. The decapitation is, in my opinion, pretty much the only really noteworthy scene aside from the conclusion in the movie. You know, there's some decent music, there's some a Jamie Lee Curtis dance disco scene. You can't go wrong there. But I feel like many people come into this not necessarily to see a disco-themed prom night, but probably for the slasher aspects, and it's a bit lacking until like the last, 25 minutes maybe. And also related, there's not a whole lot of either gore or nudity in the movie, so that's sort of another staple of slashers that this doesn't have a whole lot of, which may or may not turn some people away.
I definitely agree with the ending. I have the same thoughts about how it ends and with the song that plays afterwards. For specific scenes of movies, I'll go back and just rewatch those scenes on YouTube or wherever. And that's one of those scenes, that ending, that I do revisit quite a lot. And that decapitation scene that you're talking about, that was quite good, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer person. Because that guy was a total douchebag. You know, it's got that disco music playing, which was a big thing around that time.
Yeah, it's worth noting to anybody listening. And I mentioned this in the previous episode, I was born in the early 90s, so this type of thing I entirely skipped over. Now, that said, I do occasionally enjoy disco, but at the same time, coming from a kid who was born in the 90s and someone who didn't even go to his prom, I mean, it didn't even suck, I just didn't go. There's a lot in this movie that not necessarily related to me in my high school experience, which is okay because it's interesting seeing sort of a time capsule, but at the same time it sometimes lacks the emotion that you might otherwise expect or hope for.
Yeah. Well, just earlier when you were mentioning who's the killer in this movie, and you mentioned, you know, he's kind of missing towards the end, I think there's actually quite a few different suspects that you could really say that about. I mean, I think Leslie Nielsen's character just randomly disappears after he has that dance with his daughter, and you never really see him again in the movie at all, and he's still got the same motive, and we know he was the last person holding that mask that the killer uses.
There's one thing that I did neglect to mention. I do think the movie does a decent job. It's not great. I think it does a decent job though of throwing us potentially new suspects. And, you know, if you can keep track of the characters, which I will admit for the longest time was my biggest issue with the movie, just keeping track of who was who and who was dating, who was going with each other to the prom. If you can keep track of characters, I think the ending is, you know, a decent surprise. You know, might not necessarily be what you expect because it's pretty much not anything leading up to it. So I do think the movie did a decent job at throwing us different potential suspects.
Yeah. I think also now that, you know, we've got all these decades worth of movies, we've kind of conditioned ourselves to know what to look for in a surprise reveal. So this particular movie, I believe, had at least 4 different people that you could look at and say, it could be that person. Like, they've got this escaped lunatic on the loose. They've also got this weirdo that works at the school, this weirdo handyman that they've got.
It seems like every high school back in the 80s had one of those.
Yeah, but, you know, then the high school principal and his son, so at least those 4 alone, you can make a case for, could it be them?
It just hit me on an unrelated note to that. Another scene that I actually really enjoyed. There was a death sequence that took place with a couple making out in a van, and that led to an okay chase sequence in sort of a van rolling off a hillside.
I'm fairly certain that this movie has, like, the longest chase scene in movie history, I believe. Or maybe that's been passed since... I guess that's just something noteworthy to mention, and all the action does kind of happen in that last 20-25 minutes of the movie, so you don't really notice it dragging on.
Yeah, you just noticed it dragging before.
Yeah. Well, it didn't really drag that much for me, personally. I mean, I was kind of enjoying the build-up as to what's going to happen. You still get all the creepy phone calls and this plan that this one girl has to ruin prom night for Jamie Lee Curtis's character, or her date, or whatever they were going to do there at the end. I still enjoyed the characters, even though some of them were stupid, and maybe one or two of them were annoying.
Were you a fan of Slick by any chance?
Yeah, well, he was slick, wasn't he?
Very handsome guy.
His date, I mean, she seemed like quite a fun lady. So.
I always enjoyed that scene in that movie because it's just some creepy guy in a van picking up this woman. It turns out to be probably one of the best relationships in the movie.
It's pretty weird because when you do see them at the start, yeah, he's got that kind of creepy vibe, like he's got free candy plastered on the side of his van, or at least that's what he should have on there. And, he just comes along, spouts out a few cheeseball pickup lines.
And it works.
and it works. She just gets in, like, just take me straight to school. Yeah, no problem.
And my favorite thing about this, she actually, from everything I remember, she seemed pretty happy with him as a date, so... It's nice to see.
Yeah, it worked out well up until what actually happens.
What did you think about the beginning of the movie?
I don't really have too many thoughts one way or the other about it.
I'll simply say that children are probably a bunch of dicks and they are often annoying. So.
That is kind of what you did back for fun 10, 20, 30... 40 years ago, just playing around like that in dangerous places. And I remember, where I grew up on this big farm, and we had a lot of these sheds that are quite dilapidated, and I've had nails go through my feet and all kinds of things, just from playing around in dangerous areas. So I kind of understand the silly games they're trying to play there. But one other thing, with that early scene, I just wanted to also mention that not for all the kids, but for the two kids playing, I believe it was Jamie Lee Curtis's character and her brother, I thought they actually looked quite a lot like their adult counterparts.
Yeah, I thought they did as decent as you can expect, a pretty decent job with getting somewhat similar faces.
Yeah, because some movies, they just do a terrible job in it.
Yeah, so overall, I think Prom Night is a decent slasher. If you're a slasher fan, you'll probably be moderately happy. It's even for the time period, it's just a little derivative, but it's still an generally enjoyable movie. I personally think the beginning drags out a bit, and the high school drama, as much as I enjoy Jamie Lee Curtis, it doesn't do that much for me. That said, there are worse movies that deal with high school drama, such as the movie we'll be discussing shortly. Prom Night is a classic slasher, but it's not one of those movies I often go back to. I've seen it, like I said, about 4 to 5 times, and I've never really loved it. I've appreciated it. I really enjoy the poster. If you have seen it, really drags you in to the movie. But overall, I usually see this about a 6.5, at best a 7, but usually I'd rate it around a 6.5 out of 10.
For me, it's a movie that I enjoy revisiting every now and then. I don't think the slasher aspect of it is what really makes it enjoyable for me, even though those parts are nice and it does have 1 or 2 decent kills. The ending is probably what takes it over the top for me. I don't really cry at movies, but, kind of tears at your heartstrings a little. I give the movie a score of 8 out of 10. I actually quite enjoy it.
And worth mentioning, if you have not heard the song at the ending credits, like I said, it's titled Fade to Black by a lady named Godine Simpson. I believe you can probably find it on YouTube, but it's definitely a great song, and even though I didn't love the movie, the song itself is pretty much worth a listen.
Next up is Carrie, the 1976 adaptation of a Stephen King novel about a shy teenage girl who slowly learns that she has telekinetic powers and she can make things happen with her mind. She gets picked on quite a lot at school. She's got a religious wacko for a mother, which also makes matters worse. One day she gets teased mercilessly for getting her first period, and those students, they get punished by the gym teacher, they get put in detention. Through an act of kindness by one of her remorseful peers, Carrie gets asked to the prom by the school hunk, and also by an act of malice, a very nasty prank has been planned during prom night, which unlocks Carrie's full rage and she goes Super Saiyan on everyone's ass. That's Carrie in a nutshell, I guess. For me, it's definitely one of my all-time favorite films. It does move quite slowly. For a horror movie, it's actually more of a drama, really, with a horror-type ending. And I know you've got your opinions on this movie, which may not be as favorable, and I think that might actually be a part of it, that it's actually a lot more drama than it is horror. I don't usually covet directors, whether it's a John Carpenter movie or whatever it is. I don't usually watch a movie just because of who's directed it. But I think Brian De Palma's one of those directors that I tend to enjoy most of the time. Or at least he's got a number of movies that I really enjoy with a specific style that he uses for his movies. The movie also has a really good soundtrack and score. I believe it was by Pino Donaggio. I really enjoyed that. For any movie of mine that's an all-time favorite movie, it usually has a really good score. And for this one, it's one that I even go back and listen to on its own. The ending to the movie, it's quite an epic experience to see all the chaos that happens at the end of prom. But I think even after that, it's got some fairly disturbing, creepy moments after the prom.
Have you read the novel, the original novel this is based off?
I actually don't read novels.
Oh, okay.
I don't have the patience to spend that much time reading a story. So for Stephen King's It, which is one of my top 3 films, that's the only novel that I own, and I can't even read it. I don't have the attention span to just sit there and read. I mean, give me a movie, I'll watch it. When I say it's my all-time favorite film, that has nothing to do with how well they've adapted the novel to the screen. It's simply me just enjoying the movie.
Which is, I think, a pretty fair assessment. I have read the novel multiple times. Stephen King's one of my, which is probably not surprising, Stephen King's probably one of my favorite authors. Carrie's the novel I was never a giant fan of. It has decent material in it, and I really like the style the novel's written in. But the story itself, awkward teenage girl trying to, slowly discovering she has pretty dangerous powers, and like Chucky says, a lot of it's much more infused with drama into the conclusion than anything else, which is okay if you're into high school drama movies. Now, this isn't to say Carrie doesn't have some great things. As Chucky said, the prom sequence is fantastic. I have no complaints there. I thought pretty much everything about it, from the camera work, the split screens. It's a very well shot and beautiful looking sequence. And of course, from the prom scene comes the rest of the movie, and the rest of the movie went pretty good too. Especially when Carrie is facing her religious nutcase mother. Speaking of which, the actress who played the mother, off the top of my head, I don't have a name in front of me, but she did a fantastic job. You really got that insane, fundamentalist religious vibe from her, and she did a great job with that. She's very, unlikable character, so kudos to her. No, that said, Carrie herself isn't a particularly likable character. She's a interesting character, definitely has a difficult life, but you can, at least let me rephrase, I can sometimes see scenes in which, it seems like she could probably do more with what she has and what she's doing. And of course that comes up to her upbringing. Like I said, she's a complex character, and that's probably another one of my big issues. There's not that many really likable characters in the movie. I would probably say Carrie's more neutral. It's great to see her get revenge, but at the same time, it sort of goes way out of control, and even she's not happy with it. So I'm not even sure how satisfactory that even is. There's quite a few things about this movie that I don't love. Even when I was younger, I've seen Carrie quite a few times, as I suspect many horror fans have. Even when I was younger, it was never one of those movies that did much for me. Now, when I was younger, it probably had a lot more to do with how, so sluggish the beginning is. But even now, it's a movie that I could pretty much take or leave. There are definitely other Stephen King adaptations I'd prefer. And while Carrie has some really great things in it, such as the aforementioned prom sequence, it's not, and it has some pretty decent actresses and actors too. There's a character from Halloween, PJ Souls, who was also in Carrie, so it's sort of nice to see her face again. But there's not really that much in this movie that has me coming back to it, which is probably, I can imagine, a somewhat controversial take.
Yeah, definitely. Especially since you said it's not in your top 50 70s movies.
Yeah, that is true. On Fight Evil, after I wrote my review, I actually took the time out to list 10 other movies from the 70s I would rate not just high, but significantly higher than Carrie. And I was looking over the list of horror movies I'd seen from the 1970s, and as I was looking over my list, I realized that Carrie doesn't even crack the top 50, which, like Chucky said, is, I suspect to many people, a ludicrous proposition. But there you go.
Yeah. So, everyone send your hate mail to jigsaw at fighting.com.
I am always happy for any hate mail. I prefer non-hate mail, but hey, I get it.
What did you think about the music in the movie? Because it's one of those scores that really stands out to me.
Well, it's funny because when you were talking about that, I realized that while I enjoyed the score, it didn't really blow me away. It was decent, but it's sort of what I expected. I'm not saying it wasn't good, but it's not one of the things that really brought that much attention, at least to me. It didn't bring that much attention to it. Which is fine. Obviously, different movies do different things for different people. So it's also worth mentioning that I have no problem if somebody is a fan of Carrie. It's just not my personal thing.
Yeah. And I didn't even put two and two together here, but I just realized that we just discussed a movie based on Prom, and now we're discussing another one.
Yeah, and in fact, both of them had somewhat slow beginnings, and they were sort of an onslaught once Prom hit. So yeah, we should have had a Prom theme night.
Yeah, so there is a bit of a running theme or coincidence there that they both, well, maybe in your opinion they're quite slow for a good portion of the movie, and then all the horror type stuff happens towards the end, outside of one or two brief moments.
Actually, you just reminded me of one other thing, and I don't mean to cut in. Carrie in this movie seemed to gain decent control of her telekinetic abilities pretty quickly. Over the course of maybe 2-3 days, if that, she pretty much knew what she was doing, it seemed. And that also, maybe I took it differently than other people, because I do know that she, went overboard at the prom, but that was during emotional distress. But generally speaking, she seemed to have decent control with her abilities, and that just seemed, maybe a bit unrealistic.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that she had any control over them, because most of the time it's, when she gets really angry and she screams and a door slams shut and, or something falls off a table, something like that. But I don't think, she's definitely not out there like going, I need a pair of scissors, and then she just, has a pair of scissors fly over to her. I mean, that type of thing never happens.
Well,
so.
I mean, there was that scene right before she went to prom where she restrained her mother on the bed pretty. She knew what she was doing. She was careful not to be too strong, but just kept her on the bed, kept pushing her back so the mother couldn't stop her from going. So, I mean, at that point, it seemed like, at least with smaller things, she sort of knew what was going on.
But I think for the most part, I mean, especially with Prom, it's just, she's not even herself at that point. She's just completely taken over by her powers.
I will say, before she goes crazy, if that's what you want to call it, at prom, I actually really liked, I really, really enjoyed the whole prom sequence, not just the onslaught, but the more, when she's sort of slowly coming out of her shell a little, and her date, even though her date doesn't really want to be there with Carrie at the beginning, it seems like he's starting to enjoy her company more and more. And they share a nice dance, and I sort of really enjoy that more emotional touch. Carrie seems like she's finally happy, and which makes the conclusion all the more disappointing.
Actually, during that scene, there is a scene where she's sitting down talking to her gym teacher, and
Yes.
and I think this is more of a coincidence or something I've just kind of made up in my own mind, but just before her teacher starts talking, there's a song playing in the background, and I believe it's sung by the sister of Amy Irving, the one who plays Sue Snell in the movie. And during that song, just before the teacher starts talking, there's a line in the song where she says, "Let the bodies fall." And I always kind of attribute that to what actually ends up happening. Like, it's like, let the bodies hit the floor.
I'll be honest, I did not catch that, so that's something I'm probably going to go back and rewatch, but that is quite a good catch.
Yeah, I don't think it's intentional, but at the same time, I have no idea what it means in the context of the actual song that's being sung. So, just kind of hearing that, especially not on the first watch, but when you know what's going to happen and you hear that, you go, that's kind of an interesting coincidence.
And once things really do start getting out of control at prom, which, I'll be entirely honest, I thought at least some of them probably really deserved it. I don't have much sympathy for bullies, which is another issue I had. After they mercilessly mocked Carrie at the beginning of the movie, I thought every single one of them should have been thrown out of school, period. But I feel like that probably would have saved a lot of misery if the principal just had a little more guts. And the fact that, because some of them probably had, influenced parents, it wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been. So pretty much most of the gym class, even the individual who tries to make amends later, which was, who was it? Sue, I think. I never cared for much of any of those characters either, so it was sort of nice seeing them get massacred, even though that's not quite what Carrie was looking for.
Yeah. Well, I think going back that far, expulsion is probably a lot more uncommon than it was now, because back then punishing kids was, I guess you could go a lot further with it. Even back in my days at school, I don't know about you, but in primary school, not that it ever got used, but I think we had it there on the wall. The cane. Do you know what the cane is?
I'm assuming that would be corporal punishment.
It's basically like this fairly thin stick of bamboo that you'd whack a child with if they're acting really out of place. So I think going back this far, especially because it was such a huge group of girls doing all the teasing or tormenting, whatever you want to call it, expulsion of that many kids is probably not ideal, because just throwing 10 kids out of school or however many it was. So I think back then that type of punishment of all that detention, making them do all that running and gym work, and that was probably more fitting for the time. Nowadays, you would say, okay, yep, expel them, because that's going way too far.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and I'll be honest, and this might show some, I'm not sure what it shows from me. I didn't even consider that. But, I grew up, like I said, somewhat younger. I'm in my mid-20s now. I grew up in a time when it seems like kids are watched a lot more carefully. And if they, maybe back in the 70s, 80s, 60s, bullying was a little more tolerated. It may not have even been seen as bullying, just kids being kids. And at least in the US, we're slowly sort of getting away from that mentality. So if nowadays a bunch of girls had done the type of thing they did to Carrie in this movie, I just have a hard time believing there will not be some very, very strict and harsh punishments. But like you said, since this is a 70s movie, I can imagine there'll be moderately more lenient.
Yeah. And let's not also forget that this movie has one of the most epically underappreciated face slaps of all time. With John Travolta in the car. He kind of flicks her in the face, but it sounds like crack of a whip. Whoosh!
And that's pretty much the only time John Travolta does anything in this movie.
I really didn't care too much for his character. Even though he does have a significant part to play in what happens at the end, he has a fairly small role with all things considered.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few performances in this movie, such as, Sissy, I'm not even sure how you pronounce her last name, to be honest.
Sissy Spacek?
Sissy Spacek, she does a fantastic job. Like I said, the model looks like she was played by Piper Laurie, who, I'll be honest, that's a name I don't know, but like I said, she did a fantastic job. So, when you have such great performances, sort of a small character like John Travolta, even though it is John Travolta, doesn't really mean much.
I know Piper Laurie. I think it was shortly after she also did another movie called Ruby, which is actually quite similar. I'm fairly certain it was another movie where the girl, I don't know if she had telekinetic powers or she had something similar. It's been a while since I watched it, but Piper Laurie also kind of played a fairly similar, not religious freak, but you should probably check out because even though for me personally it wasn't anywhere near as good a movie, maybe for you it'll flip around and maybe that one will be really good in comparison to Carrie.
Yeah, and I will say I've known about that movie for some time. I actually did not know that Piper Laurie was in that one. I'm looking at it right now, and it does look like a potentially interesting movie.
And one final thing that I wanted to mention about this is, for Carrie, I personally don't have many friends who actually really enjoy horror movies or really watch them outside of some of the more mainstream ones. And I remember back, I believe I was still in high school, I had one of my friends come over and I just played it for him. I'm not sure why, but out of all the movies, we watched Carrie, but especially since he's not a horror fan, right at the end, they've got that final scare at the end, and he freaked the fuck out. And the thing about it is, it's so surprising that it would make someone jump because, and I guess it's because of the loud music that kicks in, but it's a scene that's really quite slow with the hand. And yeah, it just totally got him, and it's just something that I always bring up from time to time when I talk to him, like, haha, you got scared.
That's actually another decent point. The very end of the movie, after that scene, showcases a mother sort of hugging her child, one of the few survivors of the prom massacre, and the movie ends in a very somber tone, which probably makes sense given the whole movie has sort of a very ideally hopeful but ultimately pretty depressing feel to it, because Carrie is so close to really living, at least just momentarily living a decent life, and then it all comes crashing down due to something entirely outside of her control. So that's another thing I sort of appreciated, the more somber tone, which you can find in a lot of 70s movies, but that jump scare at the end and the scene afterwards makes a pretty decent combination.
Yeah, so for me, Carrie's one of my all-time favorite movies. I definitely enjoy from start to finish, even though the beginning, or really a great portion of the movie, is more drama than anything else. I really enjoy a lot of the characters and music, the direction, and then towards the end, clearly the prom scenes are brilliant. Even beyond that, I feel like I would still enjoy the movie even if it didn't have the prom scene. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10.
Yeah, Carrie's one of those movies that a lot of people see not necessarily as entirely flawless, but it generally makes a lot of people's top 10 '70s horror movies, if not top 5. It's a movie that I've seen quite a few times, and it never hit the right notes with me. If Avi's scene and sequences like the prom scene, which I thought, like I said, the prom scene, from beginning to the emotional dance scene, the opening up to the massacre, I thought the whole prom scene was fantastic. If Avi's scene had been like that, I would have given the movie a much higher score. Probably somewhere like 8, 8.5. As a whole, though, I'm not generally impressed with it. There's some great performances. There's some decent scenes. But if you take out the prom scene, I don't think there's a whole lot going for it. The religious, insane model is, like I said, Piper Laurie does a fantastic job. Sissy Spacek does a fantastic job also. But the story I'm not a giant fan of. I feel like things move at too sluggish a pace. There's a bit more, high school teen drama type stuff that I'm just not a giant fan of. Ultimately, I would probably give it around a 6 out of 10. Just to clarify, my average rating is a 7, so I do think Carrie's personally, I think it's a below average movie. That said, before the pitchforks come my way, I do think if you're a horror movie fan, you should definitely give Carrie a watch, because I suspect that most people would probably rather enjoy it. So I would not necessarily take my personal views of the movie as a slide, so I would recommend you see it, and hopefully you'll get a lot more from it than I have.
Don't worry, everyone. After the show, I will give him an epic beating.
And you think Chuck is joking, but is it possible I may not be on the next show? So next up, we do have from 2016, Beyond the Gates. The plot is a somewhat interesting one. After the mysterious death and disappearance of a father, two brothers come together. Two very different brothers come back to their hometown, to the father's video store, and they eventually find a VCR board game, which is sort of like a VHS tape, only sort of like with a game that you can play along, which is something I'm not personally familiar with, but I'm guessing was probably a thing in the 80s. And over the course of playing this game, some creepy supernatural things begin happening. Eventually they sort of try to, I'm not even sure, find the father's soul. Like, I'll be honest, there's some things in this movie that I'm not sure if they're explained out that well, in my opinion. It's one of those movies that has a very flashy appearance. It has some fantastic 80s aesthetics. I'm not even from the 80s, and I just got a complete 80s vibe from this. Fantastic music, fantastic lighting, pretty much everything aesthetically about the movie works out really well. The only downside is the story. It's just not that great. Some of the performances are decent, but I'm not sure if any of the performances necessarily would blow anyone away. But the biggest problem is the story just feels a bit hollow at times. It seems like they cared more about getting the feeling of the 80s vibe down as opposed to constructing a great story. If they had done both, the movie would have been fantastic. Despite some really decent aesthetics, the story is just not that great, in my opinion.
I think the plot is actually a good idea. They just didn't execute it very well, and I don't know if that was because of the budget or they just kind of ran out of ideas on what to do with it. But yeah, they just never really served it enough justice for what its potential was. There are a few decent moments where it has like a cool gore scene, and it does have a nice 80s flavor to it with some of its music and, like you said, the aesthetics. I did start out enjoying the movie, and as it moved along, it just started to feel a little more flat. Like, I kind of just expected more than what it ended up delivering.
Well, I think that's a common feeling. I think the movie starts out pretty strong. For me, it's about maybe 25-30 minutes into the movie, I start sort of, I'm sort of losing interest in this. I do think the two brothers, the two actors, do an okay job, but there's just so many story issues. You know, it's not, like I said, it doesn't feel like it's fully finished. That, you know, despite everything that the movie does right, and it does do, you know, like you said, it has a fantastic 80s feel to it. Despite everything it does right, it just doesn't have enough to entirely hold my interest. I think that's based on reviews I've read for the movie. I think it's a somewhat common feeling.
And the two brothers, for me, I mean, like you said, they do okay, but one thing that kind of irks me is that they just don't look like brothers at all.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't seem anything like brothers.
Comparing myself to my brother, you can definitely see that we are related. So with these two guys, you put these two guys together, it's about as far away as you can get.
Yeah, they look like two actors who were hired for a movie to play two brothers. Which is not necessarily the best way to go about it.
Yeah, the board game, video or VHS board game, that was a fairly popular thing back in like the late 80s, early 90s.
To my knowledge, this is probably one of the few movies that I've seen that really played with that. So like you said, it definitely had potential, but the final product just could not live up to everything that you would hope for.
And I believe it was Barbara Crampton who played the person on the actual VHS tape. She did she did okay.
She didn't do that much, but yeah, I mean,
She didn't do a whole lot, but the few moments where she's kind of just waiting for you to actually do something with the board, and there's a little creepy vibe going on there.
yeah, I suspect that Crampton was mostly there just to give some big name recognition, since she was in some classics like From Beyond and Chopping Mall. So
And Reanimator.
yeah, Reanimated probably biggest classic, yes.
Yeah.
Just a movie I didn't particularly like, but it's okay.
I'm kind of surprised she didn't get her tits out because she normally does.
Well, maybe once you get past 35, it's not a thing that women want to do.
If she did that, maybe my rating would have been higher.
I do like the typical guy stuff. Well done.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the only other thing that I really wanted to mention was just that weirdo store owner in the movie.
that guy cracked me up so much.
Yeah, just the way he speaks, it was just so silly, but kind of fun. Yeah.
Like, from my understanding, that guy's not a particularly big name or a name at all. He has very few credits on IMDb, so I'll be honest, I sort of enjoyed his performance. He seemed to be having a lot of fun. So his scenes might have been probably past the 30-minute point. His scenes were probably the most fun I've had in this movie. Like, the last, 15, 20 minutes of the movie, just by that point I was pretty much done. Things were extraordinarily chaotic. Things weren't necessarily explained that well, and despite their aesthetics, at that point, there's just not enough to keep me engaged, which is probably the biggest problem with this movie. There's such potential for Beyond the Gates, and a lot of the movie looks cool. I think the poster, at least the most common poster, I think that's fantastic. And it's probably one of the best 80s nostalgic movies, like nostalgic of the 80s, that I've seen, aside from maybe Summer of '84, which is a new movie that came out last year. But it had a fantastic 80s vibe to it. But the story was just something that really they could have done so much more with. I mean, I think I'll probably just give this a 6 out of 10. It's a decent idea, but it's a below average movie, and it might be worth a watch, but 6 out of 10 I think pretty much covers how I feel about this.
Yeah, same for me. I give the movie a 6 out of 10 as well. Like I was saying, it's got a good idea. They just didn't execute it well enough. It was okay in the grand scheme of things, but there's just so much more they could have done with it, and possibly the budget was a part of that, because some of the set pieces just felt small and cheap. Like the ending just felt cheap to me.
Yeah.
Like it just had a couple of guys tumbling around in a room, and that was it.
Yeah, Beyond the Gates is probably one of those movies that I suspect people would maybe watch once, maybe twice, and despite some okay things, they pretty much forget about the next week.
Moving along to something a little bit different, we're going to cover an action movie. We do cover action from time to time. We're going to discuss Bloodsport, which follows a man named Frank Dukes, an American martial artist who decides to leave the army to compete in a martial arts tournament being held in Hong Kong. It is based on true events, so Frank Dukes is a real person. I believe he was a undefeated champion. At the end of the movie, it does mention I think it's 329 matches, all undefeated. So yeah, I don't know how truthful the entire movie is, or how much of the true events are actually applied to it, but there's this one character in it, Chong Li. Is he a real person? I don't know. But he does make for quite a good villain for a martial arts movie. I think it's a good classic martial arts movie, one that I grew up watching quite a lot throughout my childhood, and even to this day. This and Kickboxer, they're the two best Van Damme movies in his career. The fighting in the movie, it's all good. I mean, we've got movies these days where people are bouncing off the walls, doing incredibly insane kicks, and it doesn't quite have that type of fighting in it. It's kind of more grounded, a little more realistic.
So I have a slightly different sort of origin of this. I had never actually seen this movie until I finished the movie for the first time about 15-25 minutes before we actually started this show tonight. I've of course heard about the movie, but it's kung fu movies, martial art movies, never been one of my things. I'm pretty well versed in horror movies, but once you get into any other genre, I pretty much have no idea what I'm talking about. Aside from The Karate Kid, it's quite possible I've never seen any other fighting-based movies. It's a movie that I was somewhat interested in, but it's not like high on my priority, hey, I have got to see this type movie. I'll say overall, I did enjoy it. I thought it was a pretty decent movie. Definitely high in action. I enjoyed most of the fighting sequences. I enjoyed most of the characters too. Now, small thing about the main character, Van Damme, I've actually, aside from Bloodsport, which I've of course now seen, I've only seen him in two other movies. One being a somewhat not great action movie from 1995 titled Sudden Death, and another one being, I believe it was from 2001, sort of a prison type movie titled In Hell, which was extraordinarily forgettable in my opinion. So I don't have much of a history with this type of movie, and I don't have much of a history with most of the actors. So I come from this from a sort of a new perspective of just watching it for the first time. And like I said, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Some really great characters. I especially enjoyed Jackson, played by Donald Gibb, was a really enjoyable character. I wish he got a few more fight scenes in, but I really enjoyed his character. And, I didn't care as much for the woman reporter, who I thought made some potentially idiotic mistakes throughout the movie. But generally speaking, I did enjoy this quite a bit.
With that Jackson character, and I know you don't really venture too much outside of the horror genre, before this movie, I was actually quite familiar with that actor based on a role that he played in Revenge of the Nerds. Have you ever seen that movie?
I actually got 20 minutes in and stopped watching.
Okay,
I have nothing against the movie. I think something else just came up and then I forgot to finishing it. Usually if I start a movie, I finish it, but so I probably do not remember him much from that one.
Well, I mean, it's definitely one of the best 80s comedies out there, at least in my opinion. But
Police Academy, but that's okay.
Well, that too, but... So this Jackson character, he was in that movie, Revenge of the Nerds, and it's just so funny to see him from that movie, the character that he played there. He's like this over-the-top ogre football player who's, screaming nerds. He's got a lot of silly but funny scenes and that, and then you go from that to watching him fight in a martial arts tournament. It just, something funny about seeing that.
I thought his character had a lot of feeling too. The relationship between him and Dax's character, I thought they did really well. That's somewhat emotional scenes together, and I really sort of enjoyed the friendship they had.
Yeah, I just noticed that you said Dux as just like that little Asian guy in the movie. He's like, that'll make you Frank Dux.
Speaking of which, I have to admit, that guy sort of, I wasn't the biggest fan of that guy. He was a bit much, but he sort of grew on me throughout the movie.
Yeah, no, he's funny. There's a lot of like little funny moments in the movie.
Like anytime Forrest Whitaker was on screen with his sidekick, those are also fun chase scenes. So.
Yeah. Well, speaking about those chase scenes, there's that one chase scene where they're chasing Van Damme through the city, and ultimately they fall in the water.
Yes.
From the boats, and I'm not sure if this video was a pioneer for it, but back in YouTube's earlier days, a lot of people would make Mentos commercials out of movie scenes and things like that. And the very first one that I saw was this chase scene from Bloodsport, and it's actually done really well. I don't know, maybe you should look it up on YouTube later, Bloodsport Mentos commercial, something like that, and watch it. It actually fits in really well. You're probably actually not too familiar with the original Mentos commercials, but usually someone would be in this silly situation, they need to get out of it, and they have one of these Mentos lollies, and suddenly they figure out some brilliant way to get out of it.
Yeah, I have seen some pretty well done horror parodies of that, so probably made by you.
Actually, yeah, I have made a few. So, I think I've made one for Child's Play 3, I've made one for Kickboxer 2.
Silent Night, Deadly Night, was it?
Yeah, the Silent Night, Deadly Night one is actually probably the most realistic Or the one that's most similar to the original commercials.
Yeah, I would say the Child's Play 3 one always cracks me up when I see that.
Yeah.
So well done.
Yeah. But yeah, just going back to Bloodsport, the music in the movie is actually quite good as well.
Yeah, it's worth saying. I also really like the music. I enjoyed quite a bit of 80s music, and it was, like you said, it's a bit cheesy, but I also enjoyed Karate Kid, and that also had some pretty cheesy music in it. So this isn't much different. One of them, I think it was called Fight to Survive, which is pretty epic sounding, and I thought it worked pretty well with the multiple fight scenes we got. And that's another thing I want to briefly mention. I do enjoy the variety of different fighting styles how these different characters had. We didn't really get to know much about many of them, but that one black guy who was always low to the ground, moving quickly, and that one big, almost sumo wrestler type guy. A lot of interesting fighting styles, and I sort of enjoyed the variety there.
And the lead villain, played by Bolo Young, he's quite menacing as well.
Yeah, actually, I sort of wondered, toward the end of the movie, when the final fight scene, when he threw that stuff in his eyes, is that cheating? Is that just...
It is.
Because it seemed like nobody reacted to that at all. I was just sort of like, what are they doing? Like, they should probably stop the fight now? Like...
I think it's one of those things where it's easier to see in camera, but if you backed away and looked at it, like the way he throws it, he's throwing it like he's putting his arm out in an actual martial arts stance. So, and because the powder, it's more of a powder, so maybe it's a lot easier to see close up, but if you're a little further away, maybe it's not as easy to see. At the end of the day, it's a movie, so we kind of suspend our disbelief in whatever is happening. But I think it's one of those things where it's probably not as apparent in the moment because it's all slowed down. If it was in real time, these guys move really fast, so I don't think they would have noticed it as much as we noticed from watching as a movie with a slow motion scene.
I saw this movie, of course, I just saw it today, so these scenes might, be forgettable, but there were two scenes I really enjoyed in the movie. This after the God, what's the villain's name? Chong Li. Once he happens to kill someone during the fight, and there's just sort of a moment where everybody sort of has a silent respect prayer type for that guy, and there's just Chong Li in the background waving his arms in disrespect, which is such a dick move.
Yeah.
Like they really got a great guy to play Chong Li, and also the two what were they army officers who were sent to go collect Van Damme's character. They're trying to get him back home throughout the movie, and at the end, they're actually starting to get into the fights and really celebrating throughout the end, which especially the guy who was not Forrest Whitaker. The older guy, once he started getting clapping for Van Damme, that was a sort of a small, but I was sort of happy about that.
And just one other thing, like the earlier scenes where he's reminiscing about his childhood and the child actor that plays Van Damme's character is just kind of silly to watch, like the way his voice is. And...
Yeah, I'll be honest. During the whole flashback, I liked most of the training, but like the really early stuff, like who the hell is that guy supposed to be?
Yeah.
Like that just felt almost intentionally comedic to me. Like that was just sort of awkward, but the rest of the flashback is pretty okay.
Yeah. And one other thing that I have to wonder about, there is that one scene after Van Damme sleeps with that woman, and we get this shot of Van Damme and his ass. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, the demographic for this movie is clearly mostly male. So did they throw that in there to see if they could get more women to watch the movie, or is it just that they thought we would appreciate checking out his ass? I don't know.
Well, I mean, there might be the occasional gay guy who watches this, and he might be okay with it. I think what that probably was, it's a male-oriented movie, but I suspect a lot of guys brought their girlfriends to this movie when it came out back in the 80s, so they probably wanted to throw them a bone, and
Yeah.
what a bone they threw. So I see that was luckily it was a short scene, but that was sort of fun.
I bet you had a lot of fun with it. But yeah, I mean, like, he's, he looks good in the movie. I can't lie. I'm not gay or anything, but if someone said he had a nice tight ass, I'd have to agree.
I unfortunately have no comment to that. I'll just let anybody who listens to this choose what they want to think about those words.
Yeah, someone's going to like isolate that 30 seconds of what I just said and then turn it into something else in their own YouTube video.
It might be me. So, yeah, and just a few notes about the reporting woman, Janice. I had some issues with the character. I like the idea, but when she's witnessing the fights and then she pulls out that recording device just to, I guess, go over what she's watching, I'm thinking, what the hell are you doing? Like, it's supposed to be some super secret event, and she's not being particularly secretive. She's a white woman. She's not being particularly secretive about what she's doing there.
I guess the thing is that, everyone's focused on the fight. No one's looking at her.
Yeah, even so, I feel like it was again, maybe I'm looking too much into it, but she's did undercover things before, so it just seems like such an unnecessary risk, and we never find out what would have happened if they had found her there. I was sort of wondering if that would be a plot later on, but it never went that way. So that might have been interesting, but I just thought it was a small thing that I noticed.
There are actually quite a number of sequels to this movie, but I don't believe any of them include any of the characters from the original. Maybe Donald Gibb returns? I can't remember. I don't think he does, but it's been a long time since I've seen any of the sequels, and off the top of my head, none of them are any close to the originals, so...
Yeah, and like I said, the thing with Jackson is such a fun character, and I just wish we saw him in, what was it, 2 fight scenes? I just wish there was a montage of fight scenes, and I just wish we saw him there once, but he didn't show up again, so that's somewhat disappointing. Though his final fight scene was appropriately traumatic, so kudos to that.
Yeah, so for me, Bloodsport's, like I said, one of those movies that I've just watched so many times throughout my life that I feel it's one of the most classic martial arts movies that you can see. The acting is what you'd expect out of a Canon Films movie. No one's winning any Oscars here, but it's a lot of dumb, cheesy fun. And for being based on a true story, I think it's quite an exciting thing to experience. It's got good music, a good villain, it's got good training sequences, and for me, it's about as good as it gets with martial arts films, outside of Kickboxer 2. I give it a 9 out of 10. I think it's one of Van Damme's best movies. The other movie that I would say of his that is just as good is the original Kickboxer movie. Yeah, I don't think he's ever been able to quite do anything as good as those 2 movies.
Yeah, so this is a movie, like I said, I only first saw today. I don't have much of a history with it. But it was for an action movie, it's decently enjoyable, if not deeply enjoyable. A lot of fun characters and fun chase scenes. Pretty good fights, nothing too over the top, which I'm happy with. The fights mostly seem pretty realistic. I don't usually put that much thought into non-horror movies, so I'm not going to have some deep analysis, but I had quite a bit of fun watching it, and if you're into, martial arts flicks from the 80s, or if you're into Van Damme, you've probably already seen this, but, it's pretty much like the Karate Kid grown up, so it's definitely probably worth a watch, and I suspect a lot of people probably have found this one. I would probably give it 8, maybe a 9. I would go with a 9 out of 10. I don't have any big problems with the movie. Overall, it's pretty dang enjoyable. And to finish us off tonight, we have not necessarily a classic movie, because I don't generally hear that many people speaking about this one, but 1981 movie titled Eyes of a Stranger, which has a pretty early appearance of Jennifer Jason Leigh, who was also later in The Hitcher, if you happen to know her. Plot is moderately simple. This female reporter, who is trying to discover the identity of a local serial killer who is terrorizing the Miami, Florida area. And she suspects this seemingly suspicious guy who lives in a high-rise building across from hers, and throughout the movie she tries to discover, hey, is it this guy? And well, I mean, if you've seen the movie, you know what happens, but it gets pretty tense toward the conclusion once the serial killer finds out that he's being looked into. And there's also somewhat of a side character who is both, is she, what, blind and also unable to hear, if I recall? So a character who's very vulnerable. And there's a lot of great scenes with the serial killer terrorizing this character also. A lot of the movie feels a lot more like a thriller or maybe suspense movie than it does rather horror. It is a slasher movie, but a lot of the death scenes aren't necessarily as over the top as you might expect from a movie like, let's say, Friday the 13th, or pretty much any other slasher from the early 80s, be it Sleepaway Camp, The Burning, pretty much any of those. Eyes of a Stranger has a little more of a, in my opinion, has a little more of a classy feel to it, which might not necessarily make it a bad movie, but I do think it did really well with the suspense. So even though some of the death scenes might have been somewhat disappointing, there was, in my opinion, some pretty solid suspense, and it helps that majority, in my opinion, the majority of the main actors were pretty okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one for me, because like you said, it kind of starts out like a slasher movie, then it transitions into more of a thriller, because we see the identity of the killer kind of halfway through the movie. So it loses that who is it aspect, and then it goes into the actual serial killer being more or less stalked by this newswoman.
Which I actually thought that was sort of an interesting turn of events. I don't see that very often, so I sort of like that.
The way the movie started was really well. I think the most memorable death scene in the movie was that one at the beginning.
Yes.
The head in the fish tank. It definitely got things started out on a high point. And it does have a few other decent kills in the movie. The newswoman, I didn't really care too much for her character, to be honest.
She did get in my opinion, she got quite annoying at times.
Part of that is probably because she starts out just interrupting her co-anchor or whatever it is on her news program, and I guess she gets introduced as a bit of an annoying person at that point. She, as the movie goes along, you tend to accept her for what she is. I didn't necessarily enjoy some of the scenes between the kills and the serial killer scenes. Those scenes fell flat for me. The earlier slasher type sequences, they were good. I think towards the end, where it got more suspenseful and creepy towards the end, where the guy's in the apartment, that was definitely a lot better.
Yeah, I would say I really enjoyed Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance here, because it seems to me that'd be a very, very difficult role to, you might not even know how to start with something like that. Trying to play a character who can't see and can't hear. I thought she did a really good job, despite not doing that much until the end. But like you said, during the end of the movie, when things really pick up, I don't know, maybe final 15 minutes or so, I thought those were actually really, really enjoyable. Not necessarily as classic as the final 15 minutes of, say Halloween, even Friday the 13th, but for, a more low-key thriller-ish movie, I'd say the final 50 minutes of this one is really enjoyable.
And this movie is surprisingly more violent than I was expecting it to be. And I did read that a lot of places it was obviously censored. I did read that the Australian VHS was actually fully uncut, while most other places had censored versions. So it was kind of surprising, because censorship, I wouldn't say Australia's more prominent with it over some other places, but usually we're not the first to get like an uncut version of something.
Out of interest, Chucky, did you know much about this movie before seeing it, or was it just one of those movies that was more like under the radar type thing?
I definitely heard of it and seen the poster before. I just never really hear people talk about it, and I've never really come across it at a time where I felt like watching a movie. It's definitely something that's flown under the radar. I was quite surprised with how violent some of those scenes were, especially that first scene. That really got things started on the right track for me. Yeah, just all those scenes in between. I didn't care too much about the news anchor lady and her relationships, and some of the scenes where she's sneaking around the apartments and things like that were okay.
I do think that scene in which she is breaking into the apartment of the individual she suspects is the killer, I think that scene is. I think that scene's pretty suspenseful, especially how she escapes by dropping down the balcony. You know, I sort of had fun with that because that's the type of, oh my God, she going to get caught? What's going to happen? I sort of enjoyed that. I sort of wish the movie had a few more suspenseful scenes. Most of the suspense we got was from women who we had no idea who they were, and it just gets talked and killed. And most of the kills, like you said, they're not necessarily amazing. They're not necessarily terrible. They're just nothing noteworthy. Overall, I think I probably enjoyed this more than you, but it's not one of those movies in which I suspect you'd want to watch, 3, 4, 5 times every other year.
The quality of a movie definitely plays into my enjoyment of it. And by quality, I mean the actual quality of the picture, the transfer itself. And I didn't watch a great quality version of it. And perhaps if I had seen it again in a much higher quality presentation, perhaps I may have slightly enjoyed it a little more. I can't say for certain.
Yeah, I was somewhat lucky in that regard. This actually played on an American TV station that generally TCM, which plays a lot of more classic movies, so even playing something from the early 80s is a bit out of place for them. So I saw a decent quality version of this. Unlike Chucky, a lot of times quality doesn't necessarily mean much to me. If you've seen some of the stuff that I watch, I think you would understand. Because I have seen some mildly atrocious copies of some movies. But yeah, I can imagine a slightly higher enjoyment, but I suspect it probably wouldn't be that much more. And even though some of the scenes in this movie are really enjoyable, like I said, the conclusion is, in my opinion, not even is it enjoyable, but I think it's also somewhat emotional. But that might just be me because I just really enjoy Jonathan Jason Lee's character. So that conclusion with what happened to the character, I really liked that. And even though wasn't the biggest fan of the main character, the reporter, I thought the relationship between those two was somewhat heartwarming, especially given the traumatic flashback we saw of what caused the problems with the sister. So I don't know. It's one of those movies in which I think a lot of slasher fans might have expected more from. I do think though it's a lot more stylish and maybe a little more sophisticated may not be the right word, but it's a little more classy than some of the other just, movies that would go in more of a gore. So this has a little more, in my opinion, feeling to it. I gave it a significantly high rating, probably around 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, it starts off well. It's got some really cool kill scenes in it, and it does transition itself to a thriller, which I don't mind the transition. It's just the kill scenes that you get at the start, they don't follow through all the way to the end with it. It does have quite a good suspenseful ending. I just found myself falling in and out of enjoyment with it. I'm kind of juggling between a 6 or a 7 out of 10. Even right now, I really don't know what I want to give it. I'm still in my mind, I'm juggling between a 6 and a 7. I think I'm going to just rest with a 6 for now. Yeah, I'm going to stick with a 6 for now. Maybe if I watch it again, like in a higher quality Blu-ray or something like that, maybe that will tip it over the edge for a 7.
I do think though it's a movie. I definitely would. If you're a fan of slashers, definitely might be worth checking out. You might not love it, but I do think there's enough in it to at least keep you somewhat engaged. And like we said, I don't hear many people speaking about this one. I mean, it actually has an okay rating on IMDb. Generally, for horror movies, at least it has over a 5. So to me, that's for a horror movie that seems like an okay rating. So I think people who see it generally somewhat enjoy it. So if it sounds like it's your type of thing, I wouldn't necessarily avoid it.